A stormy start. The rain fell relentlessly, the sound of it drowning out everything else as people hurried by under their umbrellas. The city seemed to vibrate with urgency, every drop of rain like a drumbeat pushing people forward. But there, on the corner of the bustling intersection, stood Elijah, a young black boy of no more than 13. His clothes were soaked, a thin hoodie clinging to his frame, and his shoes squelched with every step he took. In his arms, he cradled a bundle of flowers, their once vibrant petals now battered by the rain. Elijah adjusted his grip on the bouquet, shielding the flowers as best he could. His breath came out in visible puffs, mingling with the cold air. Every few minutes, he glanced at the faces passing him, searching for a sign of kindness or recognition. Most people walked past without even a glance, their eyes fixed ahead, their steps hurried. Elijah's voice was hoarse from calling out all morning. "Flowers, sir. Mom. Just a few left. Please." His words were met with indifference, the rain serving as an unspoken excuse for everyone to avoid stopping. Elijah's stomach growled loudly, but he ignored it. He had skipped breakfast that morning, as he often did, saving what little food there was for his mother and younger sister. Rent was overdue, and the landlord's threats rang in his ears like an ever-present echo. No rent by the end of the week, and you're all out. Elijah shivered as he remembered the last time they had been evicted. It had been a cold winter night, and they had nowhere to go. His mother, Marie, had tried her best to shield him and his sister from the harsh reality of their situation, but even at 10 years old, Elijah had understood. The memory of sleeping in a shelter, his sister crying softly in their mother's lap, was one he would never forget. It was the kind of pain that etched itself into your bones. A family walked by, their laughter carrying over the sound of the rain. Elijah's eyes lingered on the little boy holding his father's hand, a pang of longing tightening his chest. He thought of his own father, a man he barely remembered. He had left years ago, leaving Marie to raise 2 children on her own. Elijah often wondered if things would have been different if his father had stayed. But thinking about it only made the ache in his heart worse, so he pushed the thought aside. A shopkeeper emerged from the corner store behind Elijah, his face twisted in annoyance. "Hey, kid, I've told you before, don't stand in front of my store. You're driving customers away," he barked. Elijah turned, his shoulders tensing. I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't trying to." "I don't want to hear it. Find somewhere else to stand." The man's voice was sharp, cutting through the rain like a whip. Without another word, he turned and went back inside, slamming the door behind him. Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat and moved a few feet down the sidewalk. The new spot was worse. Less foot traffic, less chance of selling the flowers. But he didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't help. He adjusted the bouquet in his arms and kept calling out, his voice cracking. "Flowers, sir. Mom. Just a few left." The hours dragged on, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. Elijah's hands were red and numb from the cold, and his shoes felt like sponges, soaking up every drop of water. He considered giving up, going home to his mother and sister, but the thought of their landlord's face kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't go home empty-handed. He couldn't let them down. A black sedan pulled up to the curb nearby, its polished exterior gleaming even in the dreary weather. Elijah hesitated for a moment before crossing the street, his heart pounding. The car looked expensive, the kind of car owned by someone who might have enough money to spare. He approached the driver's side and tapped gently on the window, holding up the flowers. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in his mid-50s. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted. But it was his eyes that caught Elijah's attention. They were tired, weary in a way that no amount of money could fix. For a moment, the two just looked at each other, the sound of the rain filling the silence. "Flowers, sir?" Elijah asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Please, I really need to sell these." The man's gaze shifted to the flowers, and something in his expression changed. A shadow passed over his face, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Why are you out here in this weather?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Elijah blinked, surprised by the question. Most people didn't bother to ask why, didn't care enough to. He hesitated before answering. "I need to help my mom," he said finally, his words barely audible over the rain. "We're late on rent, and it's just me, my mom, and my little sister. I have to." His voice trailed off, but the man didn't press him. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "You're a strong kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Stronger than most adults I know." The light turned green, but the car didn't move. The drivers behind him honked their horns, but the man ignored them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill, holding it out to Elijah. "Take this," he said. "It's not charity. It's for the flowers." Elijah hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. Finally, he took the money, his hands trembling. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. The man nodded, his face softening. "What's your name?" "Elijah." "I'm Charles," the man said. "Take care of yourself, Elijah, and your family." With that, he rolled up the window and drove away, the taillights of his car fading into the rain. Elijah stood there for a moment, staring at the money in his hand. It wasn't enough to pay the rent, but it was something. He tucked it into his pocket and turned back to the street. He still had flowers to sell, and the day wasn't over yet. As the rain continued to fall, Elijah called out to the passers-by, his voice steady despite the cold. "Flowers, sir. Mom. Just a few left." He wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not ever. A fading light. The rain finally began to slow as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a faint, grayish-blue glow over the city streets. Streetlights flickered to life one by one, their soft yellow beams cutting through the misty air. Elijah remained at his corner, his fingers raw from gripping the stems of the flowers all day. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep warm as the chill of the evening set in. His hoodie, soaked and clinging to his thin frame, provided little comfort against the biting cold. He glanced at the few remaining bouquets in his arms, lilies, daisies, and a single bunch of roses. Their once bright colors had dulled, their petals bruised and heavy with water. Elijah's heart sank. It was harder to sell wilted flowers, but he had no choice. He still needed more money, and going home now wasn't an option. "Flowers. Fresh flowers for sale," he called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion. A few people glanced his way but quickly looked away, hurrying past as if acknowledging him would somehow make them complicit in his struggle. Rejection was nothing new to Elijah, but tonight it felt heavier, like the weight of the entire day was pressing down on his small shoulders. He thought about the man from earlier, the one who had introduced himself as Charles. Elijah had felt something different in that man's gaze, something he couldn't quite put into words. Sympathy, pain, whatever it was, it lingered in Elijah's mind, replaying like a half-remembered dream. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. There was no time to dwell on it. His focus needed to remain on selling the rest of the flowers. Across the street, a cafe buzzed with life. The warm light from its windows spilled onto the wet pavement, and inside, people laughed and chatted, their faces relaxed and carefree. Elijah watched them for a moment, his stomach tightening with hunger. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat in a place like that. He turned his eyes back to the street and took a deep breath. "Flowers, sir. Mom. Just a few left," he called again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. A middle-aged woman with a colorful scarf wrapped around her neck paused in front of him. Her umbrella was tilted slightly, allowing her to see him clearly. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if weighing her decision. "How much for the roses?" she asked, her voice brisk. Elijah straightened, trying to muster his best smile. $10, Mom. They're fresh. Well, mostly." She frowned, eyeing the drooping petals. "They don't look fresh to me." Elijah's smile faltered, but he held his ground. "They're still beautiful, ma'am, and they'd make someone really happy." The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "I'll pass," she said, walking away without another word. Elijah exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cool air. He looked down at the roses, their faded red petals trembling in the breeze. He knew they weren't perfect, but they were all he had left to offer. As the hours wore on, the streets grew quieter, the crowd thinning to a trickle of late-night commuters and occasional wanderers. The city felt colder, lonelier. Elijah's legs ached from standing, and his arms felt like lead from holding the flowers all day. His mind wandered to his mother and sister, imagining them waiting in their small apartment. He pictured his sister's wide eyes lighting up when he brought home even a little money, and his mother's tired smile, a smile that never quite reached her eyes anymore. The sound of footsteps brought Elijah back to the present. A man approached, his coat pulled tight against the cold. He was tall and thin, with a face that looked worn from years of hardship. He stopped in front of Elijah, his gaze dropping to the flowers. "Selling these, huh?" the man asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir. Would you like to buy some?" "There." He paused, glancing at the wilting petals. "They're still nice." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, counting them carefully. "How much for one bouquet?" $5, Elijah replied quickly. The man's brow furrowed as he counted again. Finally, he held out a few crumpled bills and some change. "I've got 3. Will that do?" Elijah hesitated. He needed every dollar he could get, but the man's rough hands and tired eyes told a story he recognized all too well. He nodded, handing over a bouquet of daisies. "Thank you, sir." The man took the flowers, his lips curling into a small smile. "No, thank you, kid. You're out here working hard. Don't see that much anymore." He gave Elijah a nod and walked away, the bouquet tucked under his arm. Elijah watched him go, a faint warmth stirring in his chest. The sale hadn't been much, but it was something. He clutched the remaining flowers tighter, determined to sell them all before the night was over. The hours crept by, and the city began to quiet completely. Street vendors packed up their carts, and shopkeepers pulled down their metal grates. The cafe across the street dimmed its lights, signaling its closing. Elijah's hands were so cold now that they barely felt like his own. He shuffled his feet, trying to stay warm as the wind picked up. A car's headlights cut through the darkness, slowing as it approached the curb where Elijah stood. He squinted against the glare, his heart skipping a beat. It was the same black sedan from earlier. The car came to a stop, and the driver's side window rolled down, revealing Charles once again. "You're still out here," Charles said, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and concern. Elijah nodded, his breath visible in the cool air. "I still have flowers to sell," he said simply. Charles stepped out of the car, his polished shoes splashing into a puddle. He didn't seem to care about the rain-soaked ground as he approached Elijah. His eyes scanned the boy, taking in the soaked hoodie, the trembling hands, and the fading flowers. "You've been out here all day, haven't you?" Charles asked. Elijah nodded again, unsure of what to say. He shifted his weight, trying to appear stronger than he felt. Charles sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "Someone I lost." Elijah's eyes widened slightly, but he stayed silent, sensing that Charles wasn't looking for a response. After a long pause, Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "How many flowers do you have left?" Elijah glanced down at the bundle in his arms. "Just 3 bouquets." Charles pulled out several bills and handed them to Elijah. "I'll take them all." Elijah stared at the money, his hands trembling as he reached out to accept it. "Thank you, sir." "I thank you." Charles smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not charity, Elijah. You're working hard, and you deserve it." Elijah nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered again. Charles hesitated, then placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow. There's something else I want to talk to you about. Something that might help you and your family." Elijah's eyes widened in surprise. "Help? How?" Charles shook his head gently. "We'll talk tomorrow. For now, go home, get warm, and tell your mother I'll see her soon." Before Elijah could respond, Charles turned and walked back to his car, the bouquet of flowers in his hand. The car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the night. Elijah stood there for a moment, staring at the money in his hand. It wasn't enough to solve all their problems, but it was more than he had hoped for. He turned and began walking home, his heart heavy with exhaustion, but lightened by a flicker of hope. The storm had quieted, but Elijah knew there were more storms ahead. Still, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might have the strength to face them. A window of hope. The next morning dawned quietly, the sky a pale gray that seemed uncertain whether to bring more rain or let the sun break through. Elijah stirred on his thin mattress, the noise of the city outside filtering into their cramped apartment. He blinked his eyes open, the chill of the early morning biting at his skin. The small space smelled faintly of damp clothes and the remnants of last night's sparse dinner. 2 slices of bread and a can of soup stretched thin between him, his mother Marie, and his little sister Zoe. Marie was already up, humming softly as she stood by the small stove, her movements slow and deliberate. Elijah could see the fatigue etched into her face, her shoulders hunched from carrying burdens that felt far too heavy for one person. But despite the exhaustion, she managed a soft smile when she saw Elijah stir. "Good morning, baby," she said, her voice warm but tinged with weariness. "Breakfast will be ready soon." Elijah sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "What's for breakfast?" Marie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Toast and tea," she said simply. Elijah nodded, pretending not to notice the faint tremble in her hands as she poured the last bit of tea into 3 chipped mugs. Zoe shuffled into the room, her curly hair sticking out in all directions. She clung to Elijah's leg, her big brown eyes blinking up at him. "Are we going to the park today, Eli?" she asked, her voice full of hope. Elijah ruffled her hair gently. "Not today, Zoe." "Maybe soon," he said, even though he knew he couldn't promise that. Parks meant ice cream trucks and balloons, luxuries they couldn't afford. As they sat around the small table, Elijah hesitated before speaking. "Mom, I met someone yesterday," he said, keeping his voice steady. "He said he might be able to help us." Marie's eyebrows rose slightly. "Help? What kind of help?" Elijah took a deep breath, recounting his encounter with Charles, the man who had bought all his remaining flowers the night before. He left out the part about Charles crying. It felt too personal, as though it wasn't his story to share. When he finished, Marie leaned back in her chair, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "You think he's serious?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "A lot of people say they want to help, but they don't follow through." Elijah nodded. "I think he is. He lost his son, Mom. He said he'd come back today to talk to you." Marie looked down at her hands, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. She was silent for a long moment before nodding. "If he shows up, we'll hear him out," she said finally. "But I don't want to get our hopes up too much." Elijah nodded, relief washing over him. "He'll come," he said, more to himself than to her. "I know he will." Later that morning, Elijah stood at his usual corner, a fresh bundle of flowers in his arms. The air was damp, but the rain had held off, leaving the sidewalks slick and shining. He glanced up and down the street, scanning the faces of the passers-by and the cars rolling by. His heart raced every time he saw a black sedan, only to sink when it wasn't Charles. A few hours passed, and Elijah managed to sell a couple of bouquets. An elderly woman had stopped to buy daisies for her granddaughter, and a young man on his way to a date had picked up the last of the lilies. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Elijah going. Finally, just as the sun peeked through the clouds, the familiar black sedan appeared at the corner. Elijah straightened, his grip tightening on the flowers as the car slowed and came to a stop. The window rolled down, and there was Charles, his face weary but kind. "You're still here," Charles said, stepping out of the car. He was dressed sharply as always, his shoes polished and his tie neatly knotted. Elijah nodded. "I told my mom you'd come," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "She's waiting." Charles smiled faintly. "Good. I'm glad she agreed to meet me." He gestured toward the car. "Shall we?" Elijah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He led Charles back to their apartment, weaving through the busy streets with a confidence born of familiarity. Charles followed closely, his eyes taking in the worn buildings and cracked sidewalks. Elijah could feel the man's gaze lingering on the neighborhood, but Charles said nothing. When they reached the apartment, Elijah pushed open the door, stepping aside to let Charles in. The small space felt even smaller with the man's presence, his suit and polished shoes, a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture. Marie stood by the table, her hands nervously smoothing her dress. Zoe peeked out from behind her, her wide eyes curious but wary. "Mr. Charles, this is my mom, Marie," Elijah said, his voice quiet. "And that's my sister, Zoe." Charles stepped forward, offering a warm smile and a firm handshake. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Marie." "And you too, Zoe." Marie nodded, her expression guarded but polite. "Elijah told me about your offer," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. "If it's still on the table, we'd like to hear more." Charles nodded, glancing at Elijah before turning back to Marie. "It is. I run a small business downtown. We're always looking for dependable help, and I believe you'd be a great fit," he said. "It's cleaning work, nothing glamorous, but it's steady, and it pays weekly." Marie's lips parted slightly, her eyes widening. "A job?" she asked, as though the word itself was foreign. "Yes," Charles said firmly. "A real job. No strings attached." Marie hesitated, glancing at Elijah, and then at Zoe, who had stepped out from behind her to clutch at her skirt. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "Say yes," Charles said gently. "You've got a strong family here, Marie. I just want to give you a chance to catch your breath." Marie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. She straightened her shoulders, nodding firmly. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you." Charles smiled, the warmth in his expression lighting up the room. "You'll start Monday," he said. "And Elijah, if you're interested, I might have something for you too." Elijah's eyes widened. "Me?" Charles nodded. "You've got the kind of determination I admire. I could use someone like you around the office." Elijah felt his chest swell with a mixture of pride and disbelief. I'd like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles nodded again, his gaze moving between the three of them. "Good. Then it's settled." As Charles prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to face Elijah. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, Elijah. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Elijah nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying more weight than he could express. When the door closed behind Charles, the apartment fell silent. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't a silence of despair. It was a silence filled with possibility. Marie sank into a chair, her hands covering her face as she let out a shaky breath. "Elijah," she said softly, looking up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks, "you saved us." Elijah shook his head, a small smile breaking through. "We saved each other," he said simply. And for the first time in months, they all dared to hope. A step toward change. Monday morning arrived with an air of quiet anticipation. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a crisp freshness that hung in the cool autumn air. Elijah woke before dawn, the faint glow of the rising sun casting long shadows across their small apartment. His nerves buzzed with an odd mixture of excitement and anxiety as he stared at the ceiling, the events of the past few days playing over in his mind like a movie. He rolled off his mattress and tiptoed to the kitchen, careful not to wake his mother or Zoe. The small clock above the stove read 5:47 a.m., and the apartment was silent except for the occasional hum of a car passing outside. Elijah filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, his movements deliberate. He wanted to surprise his mom with tea before her first day at work. It felt surreal to think that she had a job now, a real job, something stable that could help ease the weight that had been pressing on their family for years. He thought about Charles and his calm, steady voice as he made the offer. It wasn't just a job. It was hope wrapped in an opportunity. The sound of soft footsteps startled Elijah out of his thoughts. He turned to see his mother standing in the doorway, her face still creased with sleep but her eyes wide and alert. "Eli, what are you doing up so early?" she asked, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. Elijah smiled sheepishly. "Just making tea. Thought you might want some before, your first day." Marie walked over and ruffled his hair gently. "Thank you, baby," she said, her voice warm. "I'm nervous, but I'll be okay. I just keep thinking, what if it doesn't work out? What if?" "It will," Elijah interrupted firmly, meeting her gaze. "It has to." Marie nodded, her lips pressing together as if to hold back her emotions. She hugged Elijah briefly before turning to help prepare breakfast. As they worked side by side, the apartment slowly came to life. Zoe woke up not long after, her little voice breaking the stillness as she chattered about her dream from the night before. By the time they sat down to eat, the nervous tension had eased, replaced by a cautious optimism. The morning moved quickly, and soon it was time for Marie to leave for her new job. She had put on her best dress, a simple navy blue number, and tied her hair back neatly. Zoe clung to her mother's leg, her small hands clutching tightly as if letting go would mean losing her. "Will you come back, Mommy?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling. Marie knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Zoe's face. "Of course, baby. I'll be back before you know it. Be good for your brother, okay?" Zoe nodded reluctantly, and Marie kissed her on the forehead before standing and turning to Elijah. "Look after your sister," she said, her tone serious. "I'll call during my lunch break." Elijah nodded. "I will. And good luck, Mom. You've got this." Marie gave them both a small, determined smile before stepping out the door. Elijah watched her go, his heart swelling with pride and worry. She looked confident, but he knew how much was riding on this job. If it didn't work out, he shook the thought away. It would work out. Marie arrived at the downtown office building just as the city was coming to life. The streets bustled with commuters, coffee cups in hand, and the occasional honk of impatient drivers filled the air. She paused outside the sleek glass building, staring up at its towering height. It was unlike any place she ever worked before. The last job she'd held years ago had been at a laundromat. This was a whole different world. Charles was waiting in the lobby, his suit impeccable as always. He smiled warmly when he saw her, stepping forward to greet her. "Marie, welcome," he said, extending a hand. "I'm glad you're here." Marie shook his hand, her own trembling slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Charles. I'll do my best." "I have no doubt you will," Charles replied. "Let me show you around." He led her through the bright, modern space, introducing her to a few of the staff and explaining her responsibilities. The work was straightforward but important, keeping the office clean and organized. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Marie felt a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Elijah was doing his best to keep Zoe entertained. He built a makeshift fort out of blankets and chairs in the living room, and Zoe was giggling as she arranged her stuffed animals inside. "Mr. Snuggles needs his own chair," she declared, holding up her favorite teddy bear. Elijah grinned. Well, we can't have Mr. Snuggles sitting on the floor, can we? They played for a while, the weight of the morning easing as Zoe's laughter filled the apartment. But Elijah's thoughts kept drifting back to his mom. He wondered how she was doing, whether she felt overwhelmed, whether the people at the office were treating her kindly. He hoped Charles was there to make sure everything went smoothly. Around noon, the phone rang, and Elijah scrambled to answer it. "Mom," he said, breathless. Marie's voice came through, warm but tired. "Hey, baby. I'm on my lunch break. Just wanted to check in." "How's it going?" Elijah asked eagerly. It's good," she said after a pause. "It's a lot to take in, but everyone's been kind. Mr. Charles has been checking in to make sure I'm okay." Elijah felt a wave of relief. "I knew you'd do great." Marie chuckled softly. "Thank you, Eli. I'll be home in a few hours, okay? Make sure Zoe eats her lunch." "I will," Elijah promised. When the call ended, Elijah felt a renewed sense of hope. Things were changing, slowly but surely. That evening, when Marie returned home, she looked exhausted but content. Her smile was brighter than it had been in months, and her eyes held a glimmer of something Elijah hadn't seen in a long time. Possibility. "How was it?" he asked as she set her bag down. Marie sank into a chair, letting out a long breath. "Hard," she admitted, "but good. I think I can do this." "You can," Elijah said firmly. "I know you can." As they sat down for dinner, the mood in the apartment was lighter. The food still wasn't much, a pot of rice and beans, but it felt like a feast because it was seasoned with something they hadn't had in a long time. Hope. That night, as Elijah lay on his mattress, he thought about the future. Charles had mentioned having a job for him too, and the thought filled him with both excitement and apprehension. Could he really help support his family in a bigger way? Could he make things better? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain. They were no longer standing still. For the first time, they were moving forward, step by step. Elijah closed his eyes, the sound of the city outside fading into the background. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was ready to face it. For his mom, for Zoe, for all of them. Building bridges. Tuesday morning arrived with a rare golden light streaming through the window of their tiny apartment. It painted the worn walls in soft warmth, making the space feel just a little less small. Elijah stirred on his mattress, the light waking him before his alarm could. His first thought was of Charles and the job he had promised. The idea of stepping into a world so different from his own filled him with both anticipation and uncertainty. Elijah's mother, Marie, was already up, moving quietly around the kitchen as she prepared for her second day of work. Her shoulders no longer seemed so hunched, and there was a faint hum of a melody on her lips. She looked over her shoulder when Elijah entered the room, her smile wide and genuine. "Morning, baby," she said, her voice soft but full of energy. "Morning, Mom," Elijah replied, reaching for the kettle to make tea. He glanced at her outfit, a neat blouse and slacks, simple but professional. "You look nice." Marie chuckled. "Thank you. I figure if I'm going to work in an office, I should look the part." Elijah nodded, his chest swelling with pride. He couldn't remember the last time his mom had looked so alive. "How was your first day?" he asked, even though she'd already told him last night. Marie's eyes softened. "It was good. Hard, but good. Mr. Charles even stopped by a few times to check on me. He's different, you know. Kind. I'm not used to people like him." Elijah nodded in agreement. Charles was different, someone who didn't just see their struggle but wanted to do something about it. "He said he might have a job for me too," Elijah said, his voice quieter now. "I think I'm going to ask him about it today." Marie turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Are you sure, Eli? You're still so young. You don't have to take on the world just yet." Elijah shook his head, meeting her gaze with determination. "I want to, Mom. I need to. It's not just about the money. It's about helping. about feeling like we're moving forward. Marie studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right. Just promise me you'll still be a kid sometimes. Okay. Elijah grinned. Deal. A few hours later, Elijah stood at the same corner where he sold flowers every day. The bouquet in his hands was small today, only a few daisies and a couple of roses. He wasn't expecting to sell much, but he had come more out of habit than anything else. It felt strange not to call out to passers-by. His usual sales pitch stuck in his throat as he waited for Charles. He didn't have to wait long. The black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Charles stepped out, his suit crisp and his demeanor calm as ever. He smiled when he saw Elijah, his eyes warm. "Good morning, Elijah," Charles said, approaching with an air of quiet confidence. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long." Elijah shook his head. "No, sir. I was just thinking." Charles raised an eyebrow, his smile widening slightly. "About what?" "About the job you mentioned," Elijah admitted, clutching the bouquet a little tighter. "I was wondering if it's still an option." Charles nodded, his expression serious now. "It is. I meant what I said, Elijah. You've got a determination that's rare to see, especially in someone your age. I think you'd be a great addition to my team." Elijah hesitated, his fingers tightening around the stems of the flowers. "What would I be doing?" Charles motioned toward his car. "Why don't we go to my office and I'll show you?" Elijah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He handed the bouquet to a passing woman who looked at him in surprise, muttering a quick, "It's free," before climbing into Charles's car. The ride was quiet but not uncomfortable. Charles drove with an ease that matched his personality, calm, deliberate, and sure. The office building was even more imposing than Elijah remembered. It wasn't just tall. It was sleek and polished, a far cry from the cracked walls of his apartment building. Charles led him through the lobby, greeting several employees along the way. Elijah noticed how everyone seemed to respect Charles, not just because he was the boss, but because he carried himself with kindness and authority. They stepped into an elevator, and Charles pressed the button for the third floor. "We're a small team," he explained as the elevator began to rise. "But we're growing. There's always something to do, and that's where you'd come in." Elijah nodded, his stomach twisting with nervous energy. He wanted to ask what exactly he'd be doing, but the words got stuck in his throat. When they reached the office, Charles led Elijah to a small room at the back. Inside, there were shelves filled with files, boxes stacked neatly against the walls, and a desk covered in papers. "This is where I thought you might start," Charles said, gesturing to the space. "It's a little chaotic right now, but with some organization, it'll be a lot more functional." Elijah looked around, his nerves easing slightly. This was something he could do, something tangible. "You want me to organize this?" Charles nodded. "Exactly. And once we've got this room in order, we'll talk about other ways you can help." Elijah swallowed hard, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and excitement. "I can do that." "I know you can," Charles said, clapping a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You've got the job." For the rest of the day, Elijah worked quietly in the small room, sorting through files and arranging boxes. The work was simple, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. By the time he finished, the room looked completely different, neat, organized, and functional. Charles returned just as Elijah was stacking the last box. He looked around, his eyebrows rising in approval. "Well, look at that. You've already made a difference." Elijah couldn't help but smile. "Thanks, Mr. Charles." Charles shook his head. "It's just Charles." "And thank you, Elijah. I'll see you here tomorrow." Elijah nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Charles." Charles chuckled and patted him on the back before leaving. Elijah stood in the room for a moment longer, taking in the neat shelves and tidy desk. It wasn't just a room. It was a step forward, a bridge to something better. When Elijah returned home that evening, Zoe greeted him at the door with a loud "Eli, you're back." She threw her arms around his waist, and he laughed, lifting her up. Marie emerged from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw him. "How was it?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Elijah grinned. "It was good. I think this could really work." Marie's eyes softened, and she pulled him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah." As they sat down for dinner that night, the atmosphere in the apartment felt different. The weight of uncertainty was still there, but it was lighter now, replaced by the warmth of possibility. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something new, together. And for the first time in years, it felt like they could finally breathe. The roots of tomorrow. Weeks turned into months, and the once daunting challenges of survival began to transform into steady routines. The air in the small apartment felt different now, not lighter, exactly, but less suffocating. Hope had taken root, quietly but persistently, in the cracks where despair had once thrived. Elijah had quickly settled into his role at Charles' office. He had a knack for organizing, and soon, the dusty backroom he'd first worked in became a well-ordered storage area that impressed everyone in the building. Charles, true to his word, began assigning Elijah more responsibilities. First, it was filing and cataloging, but soon he was trusted to manage the office's supplies and even assist with basic errands. Elijah discovered something new in himself, a sense of pride in a job well done. Each day he returned home with a little more confidence, a little more determination. His hands were no longer cold from standing on the street corner, but warm from purpose, even if the work was tiring. One brisk autumn evening, Elijah walked home from work, the city glowing under a deep orange sky. His arms were full of groceries, a mix of staples, and a few treats for Zoe, her favorite crackers and a small bag of chocolate. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had in a long time. As he approached the apartment, he spotted Zoe sitting on the stoop, her knees pulled to her chest, and her small face lit with excitement. She waved frantically when she saw him. "Eli," she called, bouncing to her feet. "You're home." Elijah grinned as he climbed the steps. "What are you doing out here, Zoe?" "It's getting cold." Zoe tugged on his sleeve, her eyes wide. "Mommy says we're having something special tonight. She didn't tell me what, but she looks really happy." Elijah's chest tightened with warmth. Marie had been coming home each evening with a spark in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Her job at Charles' office was more than work. It was a lifeline, a reminder that she was still capable of standing tall despite the world's attempts to knock her down. He carried Zoe inside, where the smell of roasted chicken greeted him. Marie stood in the kitchen, her hair tied back and an apron around her waist. She looked up when Elijah walked in and smiled, her face glowing. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How was work?" "Good," Elijah said, setting the groceries on the counter. "I think Charles wants me to start helping with inventory tracking next week. He says I've earned it." Marie's smile widened. "Of course you have. You're amazing, Eli." Elijah flushed slightly but didn't argue. He turned to Zoe, who was eyeing the table eagerly. "What's the occasion, Mom?" "We don't usually do chicken." Marie hesitated, her hands still for a moment. "I got a promotion today," she said finally, her voice soft. "Charles said I've been doing a great job, and he offered me a little more responsibility. And a raise." Elijah's jaw dropped. "A promotion? Mom, that's amazing." Marie nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's more hours, but it's steady, and it means we can start saving. Maybe even move to a better place eventually." Zoe clapped her hands together, jumping up and down. "A new house? Can I have my own room?" Marie laughed, scooping Zoe into her arms. "Maybe one day, baby. For now, we're just taking it one step at a time." After dinner, as Zoe played quietly with her stuffed animals, Marie and Elijah sat together at the table. The dishes were cleared, but neither of them seemed in a hurry to get up. They talked about work, about Zoe, about the small milestones they'd reached since Charles had come into their lives. "Do you ever think about why he did it?" Mary asked suddenly, her gaze distant. "Why Charles helped us?" Elijah thought about it for a moment. "I think maybe he saw something in us, or maybe it's about what he lost. He told me once about his son. I think helping us helps him in some way too." Marie nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "Whatever his reasons, I'm grateful. It's hard to believe how much things have changed." Elijah smiled, leaning back in his chair. "It's because of you, Mom. You didn't give up." Marie shook her head. "It's because of all of us. You, me, Zoe. We held each other up when it felt like the world was falling apart. That's what family does." Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He thought about all the nights he'd stood on that corner in the rain, clutching flowers and calling out to strangers who didn't even look his way. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. The next day at work, Charles pulled Elijah aside into his office. The room was spacious but simple, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk near the window. Charles gestured for Elijah to sit, his expression serious but kind. "You've been doing excellent work, Elijah," Charles began, folding his hands on the desk. "I've watched you grow over these past few months, and I'm impressed, not just by your work ethic, but by the way you carry yourself. You've got a bright future ahead of you." Elijah felt his cheeks heat. "Thank you, sir. I mean, Charles." Charles chuckled. "You've earned it. But I wanted to ask you something. Have you thought about what you want to do in the long term?" Elijah blinked, caught off guard. "The long term? Like a career?" Charles nodded. "Yes. You're young, Elijah, and you've got so much potential. I want to help you figure out what comes next." Elijah hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life focusing on immediate needs, food, rent, keeping his family afloat, that the idea of a future beyond survival felt almost foreign. But as he looked into Charles's steady gaze, he realized that he did have dreams, even if they were buried beneath layers of practicality. I want to run my own business one day," Elijah said finally, his voice hesitant. "Maybe something that helps people, like what you've done for us." Charles's face broke into a wide smile. "That's a noble goal, Elijah, and I think you'll do it." "Really?" Elijah asked, his eyes widening. "Absolutely," Charles said firmly. "And I'll help you get there, step by step. We'll start with some mentoring. I'll teach you the basics of business, how to manage money, lead a team, build something from the ground up." Elijah felt a spark ignite in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Ambition. "Thank you, Charles. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Charles said, his voice warm. "You've already proven that." That evening, as Elijah walked home, he felt the weight of his past lifting just a little more. The future still felt uncertain, but it no longer loomed like a shadow. Instead, it stretched out before him, wide and full of possibilities. When he reached the apartment, Zoe ran to meet him, her laughter filling the air. Marie stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and a proud smile on her face. Together, they stepped inside, their small home filled with warmth and light. They had weathered the storm together, and now, finally, they were planting the seeds of a brighter tomorrow. A garden of dreams. The early morning sun cast golden beams through the thin curtains of the apartment, illuminating the walls with a soft glow. The light carried with it a promise that, for once, the day might bring something good. Elijah stirred awake, stretching his limbs as the now familiar sound of Zoe's laughter filled the room. It had been months since he'd first met Charles, and in that time, life had begun to bloom in ways Elijah hadn't thought possible. This morning, however, was special. Charles had invited them all to his home for dinner, a gesture that felt monumental. Marie had spent the past 2 days fretting over what to wear and what to bring as a gift. even though Charles had insisted they didn't need to bring anything. Elijah rolled off his mattress, padding into the kitchen where his mother was already awake, flipping pancakes. The rich aroma filled the air, and Elijah's stomach growled in response. "Morning, Mom," he said, leaning against the counter. Marie turned and gave him a warm smile. She looked more vibrant than she had in years, her face no longer drawn from worry. "Good morning, baby. Breakfast is almost ready. I figured we'd start today right." Elijah grinned. "You're spoiling us, Mom." Marie laughed, the sound light and carefree. "We deserve it, especially with tonight being so fancy." "It's just dinner," Elijah said, though he felt a similar nervous excitement. "It's not just dinner," Marie corrected, placing a pancake onto Zoe's plate as the little girl climbed into her chair. "It's a thank you, and it's important." By late afternoon, the family was ready to leave. Marie wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair neatly styled, while Zoe was in a pretty pink dress she begged to wear. Elijah, dressed in a button-up shirt and slacks, couldn't help but feel out of place in such formal clothes, but he wanted to make a good impression. Charles's home was in a part of the city Elijah had only ever seen in passing, a neighborhood where every house seemed larger than the next, with neatly trimmed lawns and driveways lined with luxury cars. When the taxi pulled up to Charles's house, Elijah stared out the window, his mouth slightly open. The house was enormous, with tall windows that gleamed in the setting sun and a front porch that seemed to stretch forever. "Wow," Zoe whispered, clutching Elijah's hand as they stepped out of the car. Marie took a deep breath, straightening her dress. "All right, let's do this." Charles greeted them at the door, his face lighting up as he saw them. Come in," he said, stepping aside to let them in. "I'm so glad you could make it." The inside of the house was just as stunning as the outside. Warm wood floors, high ceilings, and walls adorned with beautiful art. Despite its grandeur, it felt welcoming, a reflection of the man who lived there. "Your home is beautiful, Mr. Charles," Marie said, her voice tinged with awe. "Please, just Charles," he replied with a smile. "And thank you. It's been a long time since I've had guests like this." The evening unfolded with ease. Dinner was served in a dining room that felt more like a gallery, but Charles had gone out of his way to make the meal feel casual and comfortable. He'd cooked himself, he explained, serving roasted chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables. Zoe's eyes lit up at the sight of dessert, a towering chocolate cake that Charles had clearly ordered from a bakery. As they ate, Charles asked about their lives, listening intently as Marie spoke about her job and how it had given her a newfound sense of independence. Elijah shared stories from work, talking about how he'd started learning more about managing the office's inventory and budgets. "And so," Charles asked, turning to the youngest member of the family, "what about you?" Zoe beamed. "I'm gonna be a teacher when I grow up," she announced proudly. "I'm gonna teach kids how to read." Charles's smile widened. "That's a wonderful dream, Zoe. I have no doubt you'll make it happen." After dinner, they'd moved to the living room, where Zoe curled up on the couch with a stuffed animal Charles had given her. The adults sipped tea as the conversation turned deeper. "Charles," Marie began, her voice soft but firm, "I've been meaning to ask you something. Why did you help us? I mean, I know you said it was about your son, but this is more than just kindness. You've changed our lives." Charles set his cup down, his expression thoughtful. "It's true that my son was the reason I noticed Elijah that day," he said slowly. "He would have been Elijah's age now. Losing him, it left a hole in my heart that I didn't know how to fill." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. "But when I saw Elijah in the rain, holding those flowers with such determination, I realized something. Helping him, helping your family, wasn't just about honoring my son. It was about remembering that life can move forward, even in the face of loss." Marie reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You've given us more than a chance, Charles. You've given us a future." Charles smiled, his eyes misting slightly. "You've given me just as much, Marie. Watching your family grow, seeing Elijah flourish, it's reminded me that there's still good in the world." When the evening came to an end, Charles walked them to the door, his expression warm and genuine. "I hope you'll come back," he said as they stepped onto the porch. "This house feels less empty with you all here." Marie nodded. "We'd love to." As they drove home, the atmosphere in the taxi was light. Zoe chattered about the giant house and how she wanted to live in a place like that one day. Marie leaned back in her seat, a small, contented smile on her lips. Elijah stared out the window, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. In the weeks that followed, life continued to improve. Marie's promotion allowed them to save a little each month, and Charles began mentoring Elijah in earnest, teaching him everything from budgeting to leadership skills. Elijah discovered a passion for helping others, and with Charles' encouragement, he began to dream of starting his own business someday, something that would give back to families like his own. One evening, as the three of them sat together in their small, but now warm and welcoming apartment, Elijah looked around and realized something. They had built this life together. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was growing stronger every day. And just like the flowers Elijah had once sold in the rain, their dreams had taken root. They were blooming, beautiful, resilient, and full of life, harvesting the future. The first chill of winter settled over the city, frosting windows and casting a pale breath of mist over the streets. Elijah pulled his jacket tighter around him as he hurried toward Charles's office. Though the biting wind nipped at his face, it couldn't touch the warmth growing in his chest. Today was an important day. Charles had asked him to come in early to discuss a new project, one that, Charles had hinted, might be a step toward Elijah's dream of starting his own business. The streets felt alive, bustling with holiday preparations. Wreaths adorned storefronts, and strings of lights blinked in rhythm over the sidewalks. As Elijah approached the familiar glass building, his thoughts wandered to his family. His mother had finally begun to smile with a freedom he hadn't seen in years. Zoe's laughter now filled their evenings, her world no longer clouded by the shadows of uncertainty. Their home, while still small, was warm and filled with hope. Stepping into the elevator, Elijah took a deep breath. Charles had become more than a mentor to him. He was a symbol of possibility, a reminder that even the hardest roads could lead to unexpected blessings. Charles was waiting for Elijah in his office, a large map spread out across his desk. He looked up and smiled as Elijah entered. "Right on time, as always." Elijah grinned. "What's this all about, Charles?" Charles gestured to the map, which showed a cluster of small, empty lots in a less developed part of the city. "I've been thinking a lot about how we can expand what we're doing here," Charles began. "Not just in terms of business, but in creating opportunities for people who need them." Elijah leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Charles straightened, his tone growing serious. "I want to build something. A community space where people can come to learn, work, and grow. A place where families like yours can find resources, training, and support." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "That sounds incredible, but how does it involve me?" Charles smiled knowingly. "Because I see you, Elijah. You're not just someone who takes a chance when it's given. You create opportunities for others. I want you to help me build this, to shape it, to lead it." Elijah stared at him, speechless. "Me? But I'm just a kid." Charles shook his head firmly. "You're more than that. You've got vision, determination, and heart. You've lived the struggle we're trying to address. That gives you an understanding no one else can bring to the table." Elijah's mind raced. He thought about the countless nights he'd stood in the rain selling flowers, the times he'd gone without to make sure Zoe had enough to eat, and the fear of eviction that had loomed over their heads for so long. This was a chance to change that, not just for his family, but for others like them. "What would I need to do?" Elijah asked, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. Charles's smile grew. "We'll start small. I'll teach you the ins and outs of managing a project like this, and we'll work together to bring the vision to life. It won't be easy, but I believe in you." Elijah nodded slowly, determination hardening in his chest. "I'm in." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Elijah spent his mornings at school and his afternoons working alongside Charles. They visited the lots outlined on the map, talked to local officials about permits, and brainstormed ideas for what the space would offer. Charles emphasized the importance of community involvement, and together they held meetings with neighborhood leaders and residents to gather their input. At first, Elijah felt out of his depth. He was surrounded by adults who spoke in terms he didn't always understand, their confidence and experience dwarfing his own. But Charles never let him retreat into the background. He pushed Elijah to speak up, to share his ideas, and to take ownership of the project. One evening, after a particularly long day, Charles pulled Elijah aside. "I want you to know something," he said. "When I lost my son, I thought I'd lost my purpose. But watching you grow into this role, it's given me hope again. You're more than capable, Elijah. Never forget that." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Charles, for everything." As winter deepened, the project began to take shape. The empty lots were cleared, and construction crews began laying the foundation for what would soon become a thriving community center. Elijah stood on site one afternoon, watching as the framework of the building rose against the gray sky. His heart swelled with pride. "This is really happening," he murmured. "It is," Charles said, stepping up beside him. "And it's because of you." Elijah shook his head. "No, it's because of us." Charles chuckled. "Fair enough." The grand opening of the community center came on a crisp spring morning. The building was bright and welcoming, with large windows that flooded the interior with natural light. Inside, there were classrooms for job training, a library stocked with books, and a playroom where children could learn and grow. There was even a garden out back, a symbol of the center's commitment to nurturing life and hope. Elijah stood near the entrance, his hands clasped nervously as people began to arrive. Marie and Zoe were among the first, their faces glowing with pride. Zoe ran to Elijah, throwing her arms around his waist. "You did it, Eli," she said, her voice filled with awe. Elijah hugged her tightly. "We did it, Zoe." Marie stepped forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, pulling him into a hug. As the ceremony began, Charles took the stage, addressing the crowd with his usual calm authority. "This center represents more than just a building," he said. "It's a beacon of hope, a reminder that when we come together, we can overcome even the greatest challenges." He gestured for Elijah to join him, and the young man stepped forward, his nerves giving way to resolve. "When I first met Charles, I was standing in the rain, trying to sell flowers to save my family," Elijah began, his voice strong. "I didn't know then that it would lead to this moment. But I've learned something important. No matter how hard life gets, there's always a way forward. And sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything." The crowd erupted into applause, and Elijah felt his chest swell with a pride he'd never known. As he stepped down from the stage, he caught Charles's eye. The older man gave him a small nod, his expression filled with quiet pride. That night, as they returned to their apartment, Elijah sat on the floor with Zoe, helping her with a puzzle. Marie watched them from the couch, her heart full. "Do you realize how far we've come?" she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Elijah looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "We did it together, Mom." Marie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Together." As Zoe giggled and the puzzle took shape, Elijah felt a deep peace settle over him. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had his family, his community, and a dream that was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe in something better. And together, they were building a future as bright as the spring morning that had welcomed it. Roots deepen, dreams blossom. A year had passed since the community center first opened its doors, and in that time, it had transformed from a hopeful idea into a thriving hub of activity. Families gathered in the bright classrooms for parenting workshops. Young adults attended job training sessions, and children filled the playrooms with laughter. The garden out back had flourished, its neat rows of vegetables and vibrant flowers tended to by volunteers. The center had become a sanctuary, a place where hope took root and grew. For Elijah, it was more than a building. It was the embodiment of a promise he had made to himself and his family. He now worked as the assistant coordinator of the center, a title he wore with pride. Under Charles's guidance, he had blossomed into a leader, his natural empathy and determination inspiring those around him. But even as he juggled the responsibilities of his role, Elijah never lost sight of his ultimate dream: to create opportunities for others in ways that extended far beyond this one project. On a crisp autumn morning, Elijah arrived at the center early. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wet leaves, the kind of morning that hinted at the first frost. He walked through the double doors, greeted by the soft hum of activity. Volunteers were setting up for the day, arranging chairs and organizing supplies. Elijah nodded to them as he passed, heading to his small office at the back. As he settled into his chair, the door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He placed one on Elijah's desk and sat down across from him, his expression warm but serious. "Good morning," Charles said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Morning," Elijah replied, grateful for the caffeine. "What's on your mind?" Charles leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah for a moment. "I've been thinking about the future," he said finally. "Not just for the center, but for you." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "For me?" Charles nodded. "You've grown so much this past year, Elijah. You've taken every challenge I've thrown at you and turned it into an opportunity. But I don't want you to feel tied to this place forever. You've got bigger dreams, and it's time we start preparing you for them." Elijah frowned slightly, unsure of what Charles meant. "I love working here," he said. "I'm not ready to leave." "I'm not asking you to leave," Charles clarified. "But I am asking you to think about what comes next. The center is thriving, and we have a strong team in place. That means you have room to grow, room to pursue your vision." Elijah sat back, his mind racing. He had thought about the future, of course, but the day-to-day responsibilities of running the center had consumed much of his focus. Now, hearing Charles's words, he felt a spark of excitement mixed with apprehension. "What do you think I should do?" Elijah asked. Charles smiled. "That's for you to decide. But if you're ready, I want to help you take the next step. We can start looking into business programs, connecting you with other mentors, and even exploring funding opportunities for your own ventures." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. The idea of stepping out on his own was exhilarating and terrifying. "You really think I'm ready for that?" he asked. "I know you are," Charles said firmly. "You've got everything it takes, Elijah. All you need is the confidence to take the leap." Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of Charles's belief in him settling on his shoulders like a warm coat. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it." Over the next few months, Elijah threw himself into preparing for the future. Charles introduced him to a network of professionals, each of whom shared their knowledge and experiences. Elijah attended workshops on entrepreneurship, studied books on business management, and even enrolled in an online course. The more he learned, the more his vision began to crystallize. He wanted to start a nonprofit organization focused on empowering underprivileged youth. The idea was simple but powerful: provide mentorship, resources, and training to help young people overcome the obstacles in their lives. Elijah knew firsthand how transformative a single opportunity could be, and he wanted to create those opportunities for others. Marie, ever his biggest supporter, was thrilled when he shared his plans. "I'm so proud of you, Eli," she said one evening as they sat together in the kitchen. "You're going to change so many lives." Elijah smiled, his chest swelling with gratitude. "I learned from the best," he said, glancing at her. "You showed me what it means to fight for what matters." Marie reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "We fought together." The launch of Elijah's nonprofit came on a cool spring evening, exactly 2 years after the community center had opened. The event was held in the center's garden, now in full bloom. Rows of chairs were set up on the grass, and string lights hung overhead, casting a soft glow over the gathering. As the crowd settled, Charles took the stage to introduce Elijah. His voice was steady, his pride evident. "When I first met Elijah, he was standing on a street corner in the rain, holding a bundle of flowers. What struck me most about him wasn't just his determination, but his heart. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was fighting for his family, for a better life. And today, he's taking that fight to the next level, creating a path for others to follow." The applause was thunderous as Elijah stepped onto the stage. He looked out at the crowd, his family, his friends, and the many people who had supported him along the way. His voice shook slightly as he began, but he quickly found his rhythm. "When I was a kid," Elijah said, "I didn't dream about starting a nonprofit. I didn't dream about standing here in front of you. My only dream was to keep my family safe, to make sure we had a roof over our heads and food on the table. But along the way, I learned something important. Dreams don't have to stay small. They can grow, just like we grow, if we let them." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "This organization is about growth. It's about planting seeds of hope and giving them the care they need to flourish. Because every young person, no matter where they come from, deserves a chance to bloom." The audience erupted into applause, and Elijah felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had come so far, but he knew this was only the beginning. That night, as Elijah walked home with Marie and Zoe, the weight of the evening finally sank in. He glanced down at Zoe, who was skipping ahead, her laughter echoing through the quiet streets. Marie walked beside him, her arm linked through his. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Elijah replied, smiling. "And there's so much more to come." As they reached their apartment, Elijah looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly against the dark canvas. His journey had been long and filled with challenges, but every step had brought him closer to this moment. And now, with roots firmly planted and dreams blossoming, he was ready to see just how far they could grow.